Welcome back. We are now going to hold a discussion session between our panelists. We wanted to be live streaming this, but we couldn't do that because there were issues with YouTube. But we're going to have a discussion session within our panelist group here. So I think Miguel Figueroa has some questions. Do you want to put it forward, Miguel?
Sure. Well, I'll start with one. There's been a lot of discussion today about the propaganda campaign against China, and also about some of the military pressure that's being brought to bear. I understand, for instance, that there are now plans to install intermediate range missiles in the archipelago in the Western Pacific, virtually encircling China with intermediate missile batteries and so on. And of course, it's a situation in the Taiwan Straits and the military presence there of the American fleet and NATO fleets and so on. But one of the things that we haven't talked too much about, and maybe also frame it as a question, is the economic war on China. There was the tariff war, which kind of backfired. It blew up in the faces of the U.S. It became obvious that not only was China affected by the tariffs, but also the U.S. market itself was impacted by the tariffs and so on. But well, here in Canada, we're very familiar with this campaign that's been going on for several years now against Huawei, and in particular, of course, the arrest of the chief financial officer of Huawei, Wang Manshou, who has now been under house arrest in Vancouver for almost 18 months. She was arrested on December 1st of 2018, and she's still being held pending extradition to the United States. But more broadly speaking, there's this ferocious campaign against around the issue of 5G and the fact that Huawei needs to be cut out of 5G infrastructural development and what have you. Now there is a campaign around the issue of medical supplies and PPE from China, saying that, well, it shouldn't be produced there, it should be produced in Canada and United States and other countries. Which, by the way, we don't disagree with in principle. All countries should be able to produce these materials. But one of the things that's surfacing in Europe particularly, but probably also in American think tanks, is a discussion, and this isn't just the Trump administration now, this is, in leading bourgeois economic think tanks, about the need for politicizing the supply chain. That is to say, the international supply chain of economic development, basically restructuring the international division of labor, and with a view, although some of this discussion is kind of like doublespeak, they're not really coming out and saying it, but the implication is that somehow we need to cut China out of the loop. We need to develop international supply chain for inputs and for everything from manufactured goods to parts and so on and so forth. That excludes the Chinese economy as a way of weakening the Chinese economy. And of course, we know that politics and economics are very closely connected, and really, what's at root is this economic struggle to blunt China's economic development and prevent it from, overtaking the United States, not only in terms of production, but also in terms of technological innovation and so on. So I'm wondering if our speakers could maybe address that question.
So about the economic encirclement of China by the West, about Do you mean like the trade war that's going on?
Well, yeah. As I said, I don't know if you heard me or not, or whether maybe I wasn't coming through properly or not. But not only the tariff war, which there seems to be a phase one of the of this agreement has been ratified, but there's still intention to sign a more comprehensive agreement, which would basically um, um, handicap China's economic development and make it basically subservient to U.S. transnational demands and so on. But the attack on Huawei,
Yeah.
all of these things are and this talk really it's rather new, but politicizing the supply chain. I don't know if other people have heard this expression yet or not, but it's now making the rounds in these kinds of circles. Um, and what they mean by politicizing it is basically attacking China's role and marginalizing the Chinese economy from the International Division of Labor. So that's what I was getting at.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I like to take
Go ahead, Carl.
I like to take a shot on question. I think there are two different undercurrents right now in U.S. The one, there's Trump playing to the populist uh, sentiment in U.S. That's one of the main reasons for initiation of the trade war. And on the other side, there's the U.S. military-industrial complex go of so-called decoupling of China. The idea is that U.S. and China is too closely intertwined, according to the words of these so-called analysts, that in the event of a conflict between U.S. and China, the U.S. has its hands tied because the U.S. economy is so intertwined with China that the U.S. might end up injuring itself, hurt its own self-interest by initiating a conflict or war. So the logic follows that U.S. must move its coordinated campaign against China on 5G front, on Huawei. And I even see that it's been now tied with the so-called the Uyghur issue in Xinjiang. The report that Max Blumenthal mentioned about coming out from ASPI, the Australian the Australian think tank that's mostly funded by U.S. Defense contractor of all people. The report claims that China is using so-called slave labor from imprisoned Uyghur Muslim to manufacturing goods for Western multinationals. Therefore, it's only the proper and the moral things to do for U.S. to force these multinationals to move their supply chains away from China. And I have even seen so-called Xinjiang scholar Rian Tham tweeting from his Twitter account about supposedly a Huawei subcontractor is among those who supposedly hired these slave labor from Uyghur Muslim. And in his tweet, he framed it in such a way is how can UK sign a contract of 5G with Huawei when these human rights violations are going on? I mean, it's very obvious for people who have been paying attention to these narratives being pushed in the Western media that there's a conscious effort, a coordinated effort to actively decouple the supply chains of U.S., especially U.S. and Western companies from China, and I think that will probably fail for many reasons. One, China has built itself for the last 30 years to be the factory for the world. There's some lower-based manufacturing that is currently leaving China because the rising labor costs in China itself. That's just because the wages are rising. cheap labor in global South. I mean, we've seen that among textile industry, shoe manufacturing. Factories are now moving out of China to places like Vietnam, to Bangladesh, to Southeast Asia, and even places in Africa to take advantage of the lower tariff environment that Africa has with United States. But on the other hand, on more higher end manufacturing, what the advantage China has is it built an industrial base, and it has all the supplier chains, all the in factories around coastal China like Guangdong, suppliers close together. I mean, China built a whole ecosystem of that out of China. China has it has functioning ports, excellent infrastructure, railroads, and power plants. I mean, to replicate the China's success, it's not easy. You have to build that whole ecosystem, and China took decades to do that. At this point, I just don't see any other country that could even possibly replace China's role in the global supply chain. But they will try. The U.S. military-industrial complex is doing its hardest to pushing these narratives that we need to boycott China, and we need to force them.
I think your audio is
China, but
still going.
I think they will fail.
Okay, there's a delay. Okay, no problem.
That's my two.
Miguel, did you have anything to add to that? Okay, Ian, or
yeah,
go ahead.
Just to hop on. I mean, Carl made a lot of excellent points there. I just wanted to add. It's about, as Carl says, this would already be happening. This kind of effort to move production out of China would already be happening anyway. Right now, because wages and living standards have been going up at such a rapid pace in China for the last couple of decades, that as he says, the cost of labor has gone up. And when we hear cost of labor, we can think about what that really means, which is wages and living standards. The passage of the labor law and the labor contract law gave Chinese workers more protections than most other places in the world, according to the OECD. So there has been a concerted effort to start to move to other places, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, because those protections aren't in place there, or if there are protections in place, they're a little weaker, and of course the wages are comparatively low. So it's about repurposing the supply chain to maximize the exploitation of labor, but it's also about maintaining U.S. and Western monopolies on key sectors, key technologies, the highest rungs of the labor chain, the most advanced sectors of labor, because the West still does have the monopoly in these areas. This is why Huawei in particular has been targeted, because it is the company that is the representative of China's tech advancement. It's making its own handsets, it's making its own software, it is continuing work on its own microprocessors, which right now are still dominated by two American companies, Intel and AMD. And part of the reason why, for example, Japan and Republic of Korea and other places that are essentially U.S. protectorates in Asia have been able to develop and grow as much is because they were given a window into these previous monopolies and were able to produce and advance their tech industries and their most significant industries through the agreement with the U.S. that meant the U.S. putting troops in their country. The NatSec people will call this like a collective security agreement, but really it's occupation. And this allowed this creation of a slight monopoly sharing in terms of the profits that were previously restricted to Western countries are now being shared a little bit among the comprador nations or the protectorates of the U.S. and other countries in Asia. But what China represents a challenge to those monopolies, because it's developing its own industries, it's developing its own technology, it's starting work on its own operating system software, high profit industries for a company like Microsoft, right? Because they, their bread and butter is in the operating system. Google, the same thing. Services and digital infrastructure are becoming the new upper rungs of the industry because it requires less labor but greater profit because of the ability to find and sell information and a lot of other reasons. But China, with its domestic industries, with its domestic companies, its domestic tech companies, represents a challenge to that you cannot subsume under U.S. hegemony the way that the U.S. was able to do with Japan, Republic of Korea, and other places, because China did not make that same agreement. When it agreed to reform and opening up, it had a strong state economy that stayed strong, and the opening up happened on China's own terms as opposed to the terms of the U.S. or whatever country it was making the agreement with. This difference between imperialism, colonialism, and sovereignty and independence, right? China set its own terms and is following them still. That's unacceptable now, because for a while U.S. companies were okay with this agreement because China's industry wasn't yet advanced to compete with them, but now it can, and so this is a real threat. This is why microprocessors and other high-tech things, imports, have been targeted so specifically by the U.S., by the trade, by the Commerce Department, the trade departments, so that even through Japan or even through European countries, they were trying to keep China from being able to get this advanced technology, because monopolizing these decisive technologies and the labor monopoly that it has on the most advanced sections of the working class or the global labor scheme is how the U.S. is able to leverage its economic power. The control it has over these industries, over these technologies, over these segments of labor is how the U.S. is able to wage influence on the rest of the world. And if you break those monopolies, then you challenge the U.S.'s ability to project its power on the rest of the world. And that is something that the U.S. and other countries just will not allow. So this is the threat that China represents. They can talk about national security concerns all they want. That's a fig leaf. It's window dressing. The reality is they want to protect their monopolies and their monopoly on maximizing exploitation of the global working class.
Yeah. I was also speaking with Benjamin Norton a couple of weeks ago, and he also said something along the lines of that this is really a fight for developing countries as a whole. China represents a way out for them that the U.S. and its allies don't want the developing countries to have. So that's most countries in Africa and Asia, especially South Asia, Southeast Asia. So yeah, great. Anybody else want to chime in, or anybody else have any questions for Kenny?
Yep. Can I jump in?
Please do.
Going back to the to my homeland, which is in some state of flux at the moment, we could say. This is a very similar discussion going on, because we're in a kind of limbo at the moment in Britain with Brexit. So everything about Britain's trading relationships is up for discussion and up for grabs. And one of the interesting things that has obviously happened is the complete collapse, the destruction of Britain's manufacturing base. When you think that Britain used to be referred to as the workshop of the world, you think back to Frederick Engels and Karl Marx and their descriptions of cities like Manchester and so on, and it's all gone. And one of the side effects of the COVID crisis has been to show just how little manufacturing capacity there is in a country like Britain these days. We've become such an economy devoted to financial services and to the City of London that very basic things like masks and hospital, the protection gear, the gowns and so on, just could not be sourced in Britain. In the end, there's been a massive scandal because a huge order was put into Turkey, which is probably the closest textile economy, if I can use that term. I don't think there's any country in the European Union that really has a textile industry of any importance anymore. I think Portugal was probably the last one. And it didn't arrive on time, the orders were incomplete, etc., etc. So there's this huge hand-wringing exercise going on in Britain about, on the one hand, the fact that we can't manufacture masks, we can't manufacture hospital gowns for our health service workers. And the other backdrop to that is on the high-tech side, is very similar to what Ian's mentioning there about Huawei and the whole 5G enterprise. There's so much political pressure being put on the Tory government at the moment to keep Huawei out of 5G, and yet at the same time, no one else is actually able to fill that space. China is actually in this kind of odd transitional situation where it's moving away from the low-tech industries, which rebuilt the Chinese economy from the 78 reforms onwards. And it's already now at the stage where it's the high-tech elements that are becoming more and more obvious. And it's very difficult to see who can compete with them apart from the United States. And this is why I think Huawei in particular has been targeted. But anybody who's used, for example, the messenger app WeChat, which is a Chinese, part, I think, of part of the Tencent group. If you look at Alibaba, the online sales forum, China is not catching up with people. It's way ahead in certain areas, and I think it's going to be almost impossible for the United States, even in alliance with a whole number of other imperialist countries, to really prevent that from happening. They might slow China down to an extent, but they're not going to be able to block China. The other thing we have to take into consideration as well, China is now the largest retail economy in the world. It's got 1.4 billion consumers. And although those individual consumers are not necessarily as rich as the US or Canada or the UK or the European Union, together, this is a huge, huge market. So those countries and those companies that want to get involved in a boycott of Chinese investment in their sectors are going to be hit back. And the Chinese can do it very effectively now. So there's an integrated global economy of which China is an essential part, not just as an exporter. In fact, if you look at the figures of China's GDP, you'll see that 10, 15 years ago, probably a third of China's GDP was dependent on exports overseas. And today that figure is about half that. It's less than 20%. It's about 17, 18% of China's economy, because China's created a domestic market, and it's one of the largest, it's the largest market in the world. So I think this isn't going to work. It's going to be tried, but I think ultimately, as Ian said, it's going to fail.
Yeah, and I think that's what ultimately is behind all this, as everybody's alluding to, that if they can't compete with China on an even scale, then they just want to, poison the water, as it were, or the US wants to just play dirty and to try all these other tactics. Mr. Tao, did you have anything to add or anything you want to ask?
Yes, maybe I can have some response. Then I can raise a question for presents. So talk about Chinese economic. I'd like to have 3 points. First is about the China-US relations, economic relations. Now as we know, the relation becoming worse and worse. I think the reason is from the US side. we talk about the decouple of high technical between two countries. And even we talk about maybe in the future, the world will have two parallel market, something about that. But the original, I mean, the reason, the responsibilities from the US side. Second is about China economic nowadays. Now, after the pandemic shock, China's economic now is recovering now. I can give you some figures about that. In March, China's manufacturer purchasing managers index now is right 16.3 percentage point from February. And in early economic, and even about the across the country, 98.6% of big industrial plants have resumed production. So now everything is okay in China. Of course, we have some challenges and problems in economic area. The third is about the future. We are confident with the development of Chinese economic, because we insist the policy of reform and opening up in the global area. We think that this policy will be beneficial for the whole world as well as China. Now, maybe I can raise a question to you or to other speakers.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yes. It's about the suggestion. I talk about, there are lots of slanting or bad news, or we will call it fabricating news about China. From political figures or even media outlets in Western countries. I mean, do you have any good ideas or good suggestions for us? How can we, fight against that, or even let ordinary people to learn objective, comprehensive, or even information on China? That's my question.
Mm-hmm. So basically, that how if we have some ideas for you in China, how you can combat some of those slanderous things that are being said. Does anybody want to chime in?
Can I come in?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is really important. I mean, unfortunately, Max isn't here to make this point, but he made it, I think, during his contribution, is that there is really an information war, a propaganda war, we'll call it whatever we like. I'd say two things. I mean, firstly, my take on it is that often China is too slow to respond to some of these slanders that are made on such a regular basis. I noticed that CGTN, which I watch daily, has become much, much quicker and has added a number of features in terms of responding to the propaganda talking points that appear in the Western media. There's some very, very good stuff appearing on CGTN's English language broadcasts. So that's very, very welcome. It would be good, I think, to have these kind of programs. Again, I see a lot of the stuff being shared on things like platforms like YouTube and so on, and all of that is great. So there is, I think, some positive signs in terms of how China responds to this. I think also China needs to find ways of working with some of the left media. I noticed that China Daily, for example, maybe this is something that Ian can speak about, has had a number of tie-ups and partnerships with mass mainstream media in different countries, and that's great. But it's very important, I think, to support what might be called the alternative media, and that could be something like Grayzone, or it could be something like the left-wing and socialist press, like People's Voice in Canada, like the Morning Star in Britain, because very often, I look even at our own paper, and I know that we're relying very much on second-hand accounts that come through Reuters or Associated Press or so on when it comes to Chinese coverage, day-to-day events. So I think there's some positive signs already, but I think that China now has to gear up to the fact that it's going to be under attack, and that's going to be the default position. And it's important to calibrate China's response in a way that digs deeper into how Western people think about China, and not just having Chinese spokespeople respond. I know that, for example, the foreign ministry and so on, they're always responding to these attacks. But I think quite often it seems to me at any rate, this is often done with a Chinese audience in mind rather than the way that Westerners approach it. And I think maybe some discussions with people involved in alternative, I'll use that term, the non-mainstream media, the alternative media in Western countries, who are very attuned to how the corporate media, the mainstream media works, whether that in Britain, whether that's the BBC, whether it's the Guardian, or basically any other outlet. There's a very, very clear agenda, common agenda that they all share, whether they call themselves liberal, progressive, or conservative. There's just an anti-China agenda. And I think sometimes it's important to address specific issues in a way that tries to understand how Western media and Western propaganda happens, how it's constructed, because it's not necessarily all the same. From a Chinese perspective, it might just seem like it's the same thing. But often there's a so-called left-wing critique of China, and there's just a traditional anti-communist right-wing one. And I think often those of us who live in the West or come from the West are much more attuned to this than perhaps people in China are. So I think some kind of modification of how China responds to these campaigns, which are going to be endless, absolutely endless. It would be useful to have an input from those of us with maybe, let's say, a Western perspective who are not anti-China. I think that would be very helpful.
I think that's a great point. And
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, go ahead, Miguel.
Sure. Thanks, Kenny, for your observations. I quite agree with you. I watch CGTN, Chinese Global Television Network, the English language service, just about every morning. Well, part of it is because I don't have access to cable, so I have to watch things which are streamed online. But that's part of the problem, really. It's available online, but it's I don't know if an effort has been made by the news services there to get into cable services. But even Russia Today, for instance, is available on various cable programming and so on, but not CGTN. And just a minor point. My phone's ringing. I just ignore that. One minor point is that there's often really good material on there. Really good interviews and features and so on. They did, for instance, a 4 or 5 part feature about Wunan, Wuhan, rather, and different aspects of both chronologically in terms of different weeks in the battle in Wuhan, but also from the point of view of different neighborhoods, different occupations, how they dealt with the crisis, and how they learned through the hardships imposed by the pandemic and so on. It was an excellent series. But and this is a minor point, and when there's not the right people to talk to, I guess, about it, but I wanted to grab that. I wanted to download it and repost it, on the Canadian Peace Congress Facebook page and get it so that other people could see it. But there's no capacity to do that. You can't download these things, or at least I haven't figured out a way to download them anyway. Yeah, I agree with you though, Kenny. I find even in the past year that Chinese global television has been much better in terms of reacting almost on a daily basis to the bullshit attacks that are even the same day responses to it, and I think that is effective. So to be light on your feet and to find creative ways that we can, those people who want the truth to come out can find ways of accessing that material so that we can share it much more widely, at least to the audiences that we can reach. So,
thank you, Miguel. Yeah, Mr. Tao, if I might share some thoughts about it.
Yes.
I agree with Kenny and with Miguel. I think there are two sides. So there's the hard way of confronting the issues as they come up, and somebody in the Trump administration says something, or something shows up in the media, and then it's important, I think, for China to be more engaged, for Chinese voices to be heard on Western social media. So that's YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. So we're slowly starting to see some of that with the Li Jianzhao, the spokesperson for the MFA, and some of the other spokespeople. But we need more of that, more social media engagement, because a lot of people in the West are just getting a lot of their information from Twitter, from Facebook, and YouTube. So if you can somehow find a way to put more content on there that would engage, that would explain what's happening. The second thing is more soft power type approaches, which is more cultural approaches. I think one of the things that's missing is that people don't know China. They don't understand. They in the West, especially in the US, people don't travel much. They don't go outside, and they haven't been to China. And there is a disconnect between what they just believe what they're being told. So if Chinese citizens, Chinese people from mainland can put, if their content, their day-to-day lives, can be seen by people here, I think it will make people here just see China in a more human way, instead of just this, whatever the media tells us. For example, there's a person on Twitter who posts about his, he cooks, he drinks, he posts all these funny videos, and he's in China, he's in a rural area. And it's great. He's very popular. And there's some things like that. If something like that, about food, about music, things like that, because then I think people will understand China culturally more. And I think that will humanize China more. But I think both are needed. The soft approach and the hard approach, both are needed.
Thank you, Kira.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to chime in? Carl? Go ahead, yeah.
May I put in my... Yes, me. Yes.
Yes.
I totally agree with Kenny and Miguel on the fact that Chinese state media has improved quite dramatically in just the last couple of years, but there's still a lot more room for improvement. I mean, if you compare CGTN versus RT has much broader, wider audience, and they were able to do that successfully by providing a channel for so-called alternative voices, basically people, Western dissident views that often not air in the mainstream channels. You know, they found a channel in RT to voice these views that people normally don't hear from Washington Post. They don't hear from New York Times or CNN, and that gives RT an audience. I think CGTN can do a lot quite just by learning from the experience of RT. And on the other side, that you mentioned, Kieran, yes, really like just have American Western audience see what life is really like in China. We'll do a lot more to humanize, the Chinese people and the Chinese society. And the example you mentioned is Hebei Pangzi. He's a social media star right now on Twitter. And then watch that as his video goes viral. I mean, I'm trying to do my parts on social media, tweet videos of Chinese traditional music, clothing, food. I mean, just put on a human face on this, mostly faceless enemy painted by the Western mainstream media. And on that note, Kenny, I like to extend my invitation to you to come to be a guest on my podcast, Silk and Steel, because I really like your talk about Macau and your experience there. So I think that would do a lot more to help American and Western audience to understand the historical context.
Great.
Oh, that's great.
If I could chime in again, just very briefly.
Sure.
Yes, so I'm glad, Kieran, you raised the question of, Dr. Tao and then you about the question of the soft cultural aspects of just humanizing the Chinese people's experience and whatnot. Well, everything's changed now because of the pandemic, of course, but up until the pandemic, here in Canada, about 1.5 million Canadians every year go to Cuba for holidays and whatnot, but they interact with Cubans. They get a sense, even sometimes, it's maybe in tourist hotels and whatnot, whenever they get a sense of life in Cuba, of the Cuban people, they interact with them and so on. And that has made a big difference compared to the United States, because, there's all this anti-Cuban propaganda in the U.S. It just doesn't wash here. And one of the reasons it doesn't wash here is that so many Canadians have said, I've been to Cuba. That's not at all what it's like. Now, of course, they're not exactly synonymous circumstances, because China is much further away and it's more expensive to travel there and so on. But the promotion of exchanges, they could be of cultural groups, of academics, in specialized fields of interest and so on. And there's a lot of course, Chinese Canadians, Chinese students studying in Canada. We too have to pull up our socks here, because there's a real resource there that we're not really using effectively, and we need to do a better job of that as well. But those kinds of exchanges are very useful.
Yes. And also, as to Carl's point, that you have friends in the West, you have friends in Canada, you have friends in the US, you have people who are willing to speak up and who are desperately trying to find a way to reach out and help, and in any way. The people who are in this event today are those people as well. And these are the people who, if CGTN or someplace else has a platform, they can come on your shows. They can speak to a Western audience because they understand the Western, the nuances, the slight differences between, as Kenny was talking about, that it's not always the same. Different media, like if you talk about Canada, you have the Globe and Mail, which is a newspaper, and it has a very pro-business aspect. So even though it's kind of anti-China, it's still okay with China as long as there's business there. But then you have Toronto Star, which is a little bit more like, nationalistic for Canada. So there's, but there are differences that only Canadians really will understand. And the same thing goes in other countries. So that's why it's important to partner with dissidents, as Carl was saying, dissidents from the West who are willing to be partners with China and with the Chinese state and with people in China who are trying to reach out. We need to make those connections, and we need to give each other platforms. I think that's really the key also.
Good idea.
Ian, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, everything that's been said so far is right on the money. I'd also add that Li Ziqi is a rural country vlogger from China who's gotten a very big audience in the West. The other thing is we've talked about culture, we've talked about media. The other thing is labor, right? Because organized labor in the U.S. and probably also true in Canada, there is a very strong nationalist strain in organized labor, the big labor orgs in the U.S. And there is a resistance to dialogue and exchanges between Chinese unions and U.S. unions. But I think that might be changing. I think that labor is getting more militant in the U.S., and I think that labor is getting more open to the possibility of new relationships. So there's some big labor orgs that have rejected dialogue and exchanges with the ACFTU because it's part of the government, but that isn't a universally held opinion. I mean, there are unions and there are people inside the unions that are trying to make a better relationship happen. Because right now, I mean, the thing of it is that without these alternative avenues of dialogue and exchange, labor being one of them, the only people that you have with a strong platform that are advocating for China in the West right now in English are plutocrats, tech billionaires, people like Michael Bloomberg. And they have an ulterior motive, right? Their interest is not in an actually good relationship between China and the U.S. They just want a free platform for exploitation and to insert their own business interests into the country. So when you get people like Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates or Bloomberg saying correct things about China, I think a lot of people in the West doubt their intentions, as they should, because the reasons for that is because they want to have a bigger consumer base. So there needs to be an expansion of dialogue outside of these business interests, which I understand is important right now for foreign direct investment. And you have to have the lifelines and the context that you can use. And right now, those are the most prominent people. But they're all alternatives as have been discussed here. But I don't want us to give short shrift to organized labor in the U.S., which is facing a lot of setbacks and is facing a lot of difficulties. But if there was a better understanding of labor in China, for example, because there is this commonly held perception among many in organized labor and in the left in the U.S. and Canada that China does not respect the rights of workers, that China doesn't have a good situation for its workers, that wages are not going up, even though they objectively have, that living standards are not going up, even though they objectively are, worker protections aren't going up, even though they objectively are. There's a lot of misconceptions about Chinese labor. And I think it is definitely in our interests, both China and the US, to better the situation for workers in both countries, Canada as well, around the world, if there was a better understanding and a better relationship between the organized labor, the labor organizations in each country. So that's another angle that I think is rich and worth exploring, so that we can create, a people-centered set of stories, as opposed to a set of stories that is only being told by the richest people in the world, who, for very good reason, are doubted and mistrusted by a good segment of the population.
Yeah. I also just want to say that both Ian and Carl and Max Blumenthal, and as well as Ian Goodrum and Carl Jha. If you're not following them, they do great work on Twitter. And Ian and Carl's focus is more on China, and just constantly challenging and fighting off and explaining and doing so like nonstop work to present China as a like larger, more nuanced, more objective player, instead of just this boogeyman monster that the media here has made it out to be. So I mean, these are the people that I would recommend. And that's why we invited them to this forum, because they do have those connections and they have this Western lens. So they're able to speak to a Western audience as well as speak from a Chinese, bring a Chinese perspective. So that's the combination that you really need. And I think if Chinese media, which is an amazing, like huge amounts of media production that's going on that I see. I watch CGTN. I watch Xinhua. You can see some of these on YouTube as well. So they are already there. You can see clips there. If they invite more of these people, like not just business people, as Ian was saying, not just business people, but people who are politically on the left and who are politically aligned with China's model, but who are able to speak to a Western audience, I think that's going to make a huge difference. I think that will. Did that help with your question? Did that answer some of your?
Yes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions or any other points of discussion? The floor is open. I think we might have. I think Carl is not with us. Uh-oh. Okay. All right. Well, what I'm just gonna close it up then. Is there something that you would like to? Is there anything that you want to share as a closing thought, just based on what our discussion, or anything else that was left out? For my end, I'm just going to say that, as my colleague Alex also brought up with me, that there is a lot of what's happening is this anti-China rhetoric is translating into anti-Asian racism in the West, because there's, the people who live in the West who are of Asian descent or who look Asian, especially East Asian, they don't even have to be Chinese. They can be Korean or Indonesian or Malaysian or anything. And they are facing a lot of, more racism than usual. In fact, some physical attacks have happened in all kinds of, in the US, in Canada, in Britain. So there's a backlash. So the economic warfare, the political wrangling translates also to this kind of day-to-day lived experience of people. And I think that that's something that we need to make those connections for people sometimes, because in fact, as somebody who grew up in the US right after 9/11, I saw how anti-Muslim hatred or Islamophobia was built up as part of a, the war on terror, what they call the war on terror. And it was part of convincing the public that, Muslims are the enemy, they're the bad other guys, and, they're all the same. And there was this build up to the wars that happened in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in Afghanistan. And a lot of that, the build up the war was happening out there, but inside these Western countries, that translated to all this extreme racism as well as surveillance of
I'm
Muslims.
here.
Oh, you're back. Great. Hi, Carl. So I'm just comparing anti-China and anti-China rhetoric with Islamophobia as well, which took place in order to justify the wars that were happening right after 9/11. So I'm talking about the anti-Asian racism that is also happening, and we need to, I think, make those connections. So anybody else have anything you want to add as your closing remarks? Go ahead, Kenny.
Yeah, something we didn't necessarily touch on directly. I think other people have responded to it in various ways. When we talk about the Cold War, I'm old enough, I'm afraid, to remember, the anti-Soviet campaigns in Europe and Britain and America from the 80s and so on. And it strikes me that one of the really dangerous things here is that this kind of embedded anti-communism is not only reasserting itself anew, but it's now combined with a very, very toxic form of racism directed towards Asian people, like you were saying, and that wasn't really an element of Cold War anti-communism. Of course, the portrayal of Soviet people as robots, as automatons, as unthinking, unfeeling, unemotional non-humans was always there. But in the end, you couldn't deny that they were often blue-eyed, blonde-haired people who, in any other context or with any other passport, would have been deified in the West. And now you have this very, very nasty, toxic, Orientalist racism, which is really, really damaging. And I have to say, one of the most shocking things I've seen is the way in which it's become, this kind of racism has become legitimized even within the liberal and progressive so-called media in the West. It's really very damaging and very, very dangerous. And that's something we need to address. So it's the fusion of these two things, a kind of traditional anti-communism, very, very Cold War in its origins, but it's coming to the fore again. And this toxic 100-year-old hatred of Asians in the East. And it's somehow coalescing into something more dangerous in a sense than either of those two elements individually.
Thank you. I think one of the things, Mr. Tao, that you might also want to, we discussed this on the left, is that there is a huge, long history of the U.S., for example, especially the U.S., destabilizing and causing, going in and doing regime change in a lot of countries, even assassinating elected officials in all parts of the world, Latin America, Middle East, and all of this is common knowledge. Anybody can look this up, but most people still don't. But I think that if there were more ways that if China, or if there was a way for Chinese media to sometimes focus on those things, then you're no longer just playing the US's game. You're kind of showing that you have some stuff also. And I think, you have some dirt. And it's a saying, basically, like if you have, China has not done those things. It has, people who call China things like, oh, China's being imperialist in Africa or something. They're completely ignoring the decades of history of the US destroying African nations. And I think that that's something that should be talked about more. And it's something that China should not be afraid of bringing up, especially in the countries that China is now helping build up. Like, I'm from Pakistan originally. And, there's a huge history of America, of the US exploiting Pakistan. And it's something that we need to keep in mind, is that there is a long, very bad history of the US doing these things. And it's not it's something we should be openly talking about, what they did in all over Latin America, in what they're still doing in Venezuela, Cuba, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, as well as what they've done in the Middle East, Libya, Iran, Iraq. So these are things that, it's sometimes, as there's a saying in English, that the best defense is a good offense. So if there's an information war, it shouldn't just be that you have to defend yourself. Sometimes it's okay to maybe make some statements about the other guy. That's my opinion. Okay, anybody else want to have any closing remarks or any other thoughts? Feel free to unmute yourself and go right ahead. Is Miguel still with us? I think Miguel. Oh,
I don't see him. I just want to reemphasize the fact that, yes, so I mean, this is true of us on the left and the West, as well as China, how often we're being put on the back foot and having to defend, right, and to fight against a line being propagated by the U.S. or somewhere else, because they have so many institutional advantages, because the media platforms that they control are so much bigger and have so much more of an audience, and because of the economic advantages that the U.S. and other Western countries have through decades of imperialism, centuries, if you want to include a pre-capitalist period. And so these are built-in advantages that they're going to have and that they're going to be relying on, and it is going to keep us on the defensive a lot of the time. However, a situation like this, awful as the epidemic was in China, the recovery has been incredible, and it's hard for that to be denied. They're trying their best to deny the reality of the recovery and the reality of the aid that's being given, and the correct path that China is taking in the wake of this epidemic in the country. But the contrast is becoming more and more clear because the U.S. has been handling it so poorly and China has been handling it so well. So this is why the attacks have intensified, but it does provide an opportunity for us to share, as Kieran said, lay out our own narratives, lay out our own points on the basis of a positive example. And for once, China, this is an opportunity for China to set the narrative, which it's doing very well by publicizing the outbreak control measures it's doing, by publicizing the huge mass testing that's underway right now in Wuhan and elsewhere as a result of just a few cases being discovered. This is a way to show that the Chinese response is the right one and that the Chinese system works. We need to be thinking about more opportunities to do this, to set the agenda, to set the narratives, to put everybody else on the defensive and have to come up with these wild and ridiculous theories that have no basis in fact, because then you can say, well, that's not true for this, and this reason. But the reason why the theories are being put out is because the U.S. is desperate for something. They need some line of attack, and this is a positive development, even though this is obviously we don't want people to be getting sick and dying anywhere in the U.S. or China. And then the responsibility absolutely falls to the people in charge in the U.S. for their failure, their dereliction of duty, and their inability to handle this. Some could say that it's almost an intentional result of capital not caring about the people that it exploits, which is of course true. But this situation being what it is, we can't change how the situation is, and if we want to be able to defeat this virus, and so, for example, when a vaccine is created and is able to be manufactured, I hope it's from China, because I don't trust the U.S. not to try to profit off a vaccine. So I trust China to distribute it for low or no cost, which would be another thing. Continuing to publicize the good things that China is doing, both within its borders and around the rest of the world. And in a case like this, a global story, it's impossible to deny the reality, much as the media and the government of the U.S. will try. So again, publicizing good things that are happening in Africa, that are happening in Latin America, South America, that are happening in China and in other parts of Asia as a result of Chinese policy and Chinese actions is the way to go. Because again, you put your opponents, and we do need to be thinking about this in these terms, because this is how the U.S. is thinking about it. Put them on the defensive, and put them on the burden of proof is on them to say why this is a bad thing and not a good thing, when the reality is so very clear that it is a good thing. So as bad a situation as this is for the world, China's actions can help make things better for the world and to improve China's image in the eyes of the rest of the world. So it is certainly a crisis, but it is one that does present positive eventualities or positive responses. We can show that people united can be strong and can win, and China can be the vehicle by which we talk about this sort of thing, and by which we do overcome this pandemic. And if that is the case, then there will be no recourse for the U.S. and other countries than to admit the truth, even if it may be difficult. And I'm not being overly optimistic when I say this. There was that period in early March when the WHO came back from its trip to China and interviewed with New York Times, with NPR, with other media outlets, and basically they aired the words word for word, and the WHO said this has been an incredible response. Here's why. And there was a brief period of a couple of weeks where the Western press actually did have to admit that things were going well. Then, of course, there was an equal and opposite reaction by the government to get the media back on the same page of attacking China. But it's in those moments where the truth and the success becomes undeniable that we can win people over, and we can help people see the facts for what they are.
Yeah. Absolutely. You know, the way that China has, as Mr. Tao said in his speech, China has sent protective equipment and medical supplies to over 150 countries and organizations. And I've seen, you know, reports from Chinese media about it, you know, all the countries that China is helping, including Japan, including Palestine and Cuba and Venezuela, Iran, Italy, and US and Canada as well. So, you know, those are stories that you will never hear. I have not seen them out, you know, by Western media. They just don't cover them. And it's specific, like it's deliberately left out. But I do think that it's important for those things to be talked about and to be made public and to be discussed over and over, because those are you know, the human stories and the stories about and even if Western media wants to twist it as like, oh, China is just trying to do soft power or whatever, like, that's okay. They can say that, because you know what? China is actually helping those countries, and people see that. People see that, and people know that, you know, my country has no, you know, we don't have masks. The healthcare workers are wearing garbage bags, trash bags, and you know, they don't have masks. They're dying, and China is sending millions and millions of masks to all these countries all over the world, and is offering to send to even the US. You know, there's already been some that have come to California, and I think a couple of other states. Chicago, I think, got some, but you know, it's very like it's specific, right? Because there's no national movement, there's no federal government move to try to get help from China, but that China is still helping is something that should be emphasized, I think, over and over. Carl, did you have anything to add before we wrap up? Your camera's off. Carl, you with us? Can't hear you. Okay. I think I'm not hearing from Miguel. I think his internet might have gone down. If there's nothing else, then I think we'll wrap up. We still have Ian, Carl, and Mr. Tao with us. And Kenny, of course. Or did Kenny leave? Nope, Kenny's with us. Okay, great. Hello. Well, thank you so much. I just want to say thank you to everyone for attending today's session. This was very productive. Thank you for sticking with us. I know we went a little beyond our time period. And thank you for the wonderful discussion. That was very useful. Thank you to Kenny, to Carl, to Ian, to Max, and to Mr. Tao from the CPAPD. And hopefully we will talk to you again. Have a good night. Have a good day.